Yes, Edison.
I have 3 questions from Hatcher's video, which I loved. And I'd like you to discuss each one of these separately. One is he talked a little bit about the God particle and about how we can't find it because you can't split anything smaller than. I kind of got mixed up after we went to atoms and quarks, and I got a little mixed up. So I wanted to know what his proof was why we can't find a God particle, because he was making a big case on that, and I didn't really follow it. My second question is, he referenced that the future, I mean that the spiritual realm, though, that this world looks a lot like what the spiritual realm would look like. And I've never heard that, and I don't understand. Does that mean like the other worlds of God are going to have mountains and seas? I mean, I don't really understand what he was referring to there. And my third question, Robert Stockman in his book makes a big deal about the attributes of God, that humans are the only creature that God created that get to have the chance to mirror all of the attributes of God. So I was really interested in all of the attributes of God. And then Hatcher's talk refers to the fact that God doesn't have any of these attributes, and that just to show that there's perfection in God and a lack of defect, that they're described as these attributes. So I'm mixed up by these 3 concepts.
Okay, so let me address briefly all 3, and then we will open the floor for discussion. Now, the first one, let me tell you at the outset, last time I studied science was 50 years ago. So therefore, all my comments about science will not be, highly, I don't know the word is. Anyway, I'm not an expert. What we usually call by God particle is in the context of the atheist thought that there is one particle from which everything else was developed without God's intervention. That's how I understand the idea of God particle, the Higgs boson, yes, or something else. Now, this question of finding such a particle actually opens at least several themes, and it is not an easy question. Number one, in some answered questions, Abdul-Baha begins by saying that all nature is governed by one law. And we still do not know what kind of law is that. When last time I checked scientific literature, scientists were looking for some kind of theory that would explain the gravitational force, what was this? So there are 4: electromagnetic, gravitational, weak, and the fourth one. They wanted to make it one theory that would explain all of those. So maybe that will be the one law. But, one law that governs the universe and the God particle are 2 different concepts. Because according to Baha'i teachings, the laws of nature were created by God himself, and therefore the laws that we discover are simply the way the world is operating. While the God particle and the existence of this smallest or tiniest or the simplest particle is actually questionable by itself, because in other parts of some answered questions, Abdul-Baha explicitly tells us that the material universe is based on the law of composition and decomposition. Everything that is material is composed of some elements, and after its death, it will be decomposed into some elements. But whether there are some things in the universe that are simple and not part of some kind of composition, he never tells. So maybe there are no such particles that exist by themselves and are not part of some kind of composite entity. And from this perspective, there is no God particle whatsoever. This is number two. Number three, again, even if we find this tiny, smallest element in the universe out of which everything proceeded, we still do not conclude that therefore God has nothing to do with the creation of the universe, because and the point is quite simple, that God is not part of matter, that matter is dependent upon God, and therefore any particle that will be the smallest, the tiniest, etc., is God particle only, quote unquote. So we should not mix up our ideas about God on the one hand and the material universe on the other hand. So these are my comments about the topic, but I do not pretend to know a lot about that and to explain this in great details. The second question was about, could you please remind me? I remember the third one was about the attributes of God. What was the second one?
The second one was, it was referenced as though this life is this world
spiritual and material.
Spiritual world. Yeah.
Look, I remember reading Abdul-Baha, who says that this, he was asked how to understand the spiritual world, and he was saying that the spiritual world is basically, or our soul, is not something that is in us, but is something that encompasses us. And therefore, when he's asked about the spiritual world, he also says that the spiritual world is a parallel counterpart of the material world. It encompasses the material world. So how do I personally understand that? So imagine that this world is actually one integrated unity. The distinction between matter and spirit is the distinction that we as humans make because we live in the material part of this world, and we have sense perception that is attuned to see, touch, feel, etc., material parts of the world, but we do not have the spiritual senses. Our spiritual senses will not be formed until we die. So Abdul-Baha says, when we die, then our spiritual senses will develop, and we will see the spiritual world, which is actually greater, better, richer, etc., and which is actually the cause of the material world. Then he also says that everything that happens on the material plane it has also a counterpart that is happening on the spiritual plane. In fact, first it happens on the spiritual plane, and then it descends into the material plane. So let me explain how I understand that. Again, my personal take on this. We live as humans in one tiny slice of reality that we called matter. However, the reality is much greater, but since we do not have the spiritual means to understand it, we simply do not notice it. The spiritual world is right here. So when people tell me, so when the person dies, where would he or she go? Nowhere. It will be here. We do not notice the spiritual level of reality, which is right here, right now. We simply do not have means to communicate with that spiritual reality. So when we die and our spiritual eyes are open, we may see the same world, but from a different perspective, from the spiritual perspective, which we simply do not see now. And it comes back to the metaphor of living in nature, which is the same as being in the womb of the mother. The world is still the same. When you are born, you are not entering any different world. It's the same world. It's simply you could not have noticed that spiritual level of reality. Only when you are born and develop your spiritual senses, you actually understand your previous life. So number 3, attributes of God. When it comes to this issue, I have to say that this is a philosophical issue that have been discussed for millennia in Jewish, Christian, and Muslim philosophy. What do we mean by the attribute of God? The philosophical problem is that God escapes definitions. We cannot define God because any definition means limitation, and God is unlimited, number 1. Number 2, we cannot define God because the character in the novel cannot define the author of the novel. The best we can do is to meet on the pages of the novel a person who's the character, whose name would be God. That's what we call the manifestation of God. But that's the best we can do. So therefore, the question arises, the philosophical question arises, what do we actually mean when we talk about an entity which cannot be described and defined? And that was the question for Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. And there were many approaches to those issues. Again, I will tell you my personal opinion that the best approach was formulated by a Jewish medieval philosopher, Maimonides, who said that the sentence that God is like omnibenevolent should not be taken literally, number 1, and should not be taken in a positive way. Because when you take something in the positive way, you define it, and God escapes any definition. So therefore, when you say that God is omnibenevolent, what you mean is that you are saying that God is lacking any limitation in goodness that you experience in this world. Yes, apophatic theology, exactly. Negative theology. So any affirmation about God is actually a negation of any worldly attribute for God. So negation, that's what we mean when we're saying that God is omnibenevolent. That's the first point. The second point, practically speaking, by the attribute of God, we mean human virtue. It's the same thing. And when we say that we want to be closer to God, it means, translation into ordinary language is that we want to develop virtues, human virtues. And the more virtuous we are, the closer we are to God, meaning that the more spiritual we are. And if you translate this whole discourse about God's attribute to the word of virtue, you will see that all religions agree on that. All religions are about the developments of virtues. Some call them perfections, like Buddhists. Some call them virtues. Some call them God's attributes, etc. And one more comment about attributes. In the ancient Jewish faith, in biblical Judaism, basically you have the attributes and the names of God. So the difference is that the attributes are the qualities, and the names are the actions. In both cases, we are talking about spiritual or symbolic understanding. But when we are saying that God is omnibenevolent and et cetera, these are qualities that should be taken negatively. And when we say that, when Moses encounters God in the burning bush and asks for some kind of ID because he is not sure that this God is the God of the ancestors, the God replies, "I am who I am," or "I am becoming who I am becoming," or "I am I am who gives life. I am who gives being." So this is an action. Be the giver of life. And Jesus becomes the savior. So God saves. The glory of God, Baha'u'llah, becomes God is shining. So these are God's actions, so to say, but we have to take it in symbolic ways. So let me finish this with a joke. An advertisement, the bank advertisement. Jesus saves, but we save you more.